Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. We're going to be looking at a video clip, a short video clip done by Dr. Robyn Walsh, she does a lot of videos now on Dr. Bart Ehrman's channel. So one of the things I want to talk about is Luke's preface, because that's one of the things that she talked about. One of the things that she said was interesting to me because of all the things that she showed dynamically in relation to the historicity. Did he have any eyewitness accounts? It's about an 8-minute video. I'll have the clip for that for you available where you can watch the entire video. But then I got to the middle of it, and I was quite surprised to see that she brought a historical argument to the table. And one of those historical arguments she brought to the table was in relation to a physician who had a similar opening, or if you would, a similar preface. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up two things. I'm going to pull up her quote. I'm going to keep this short, very short episode. I'm going to pull up her quote so that you can see it. Then I'm going to pull up my notes that I've been doing for years on this subject. And I'm going to read over them and say, hey, this is what Christians have been saying all along. Now, it's interesting how she goes about it. But at the end of the day, I think that she actually paints an accurate picture and puts a little plug in there that, hey, the writer of Luke seems to know medical manuals or is familiar with medical manuals. Who would have thought, right? So I'm going to go ahead and bring her on the screen. We're going to listen to her clip. We're going to break it down.
One is really interesting. It's by an ancient physician by the name of Dioscorides.
Yeah, and forgive the sound difference from her mouth moving. That's actually how the original clip was. I went back and made sure it corrects itself in a minute. I don't know if she had a lag when she was recording this originally, but it is interesting what she brings up here. Now, notice what she says.
And we'll put it up here too. I am going to read this one. It may be less familiar to you, or at least kind of run through it. Although many reports have been made, not only in the past, but also recently, about the production, effects, and testing of medicines, I nevertheless intend to instruct you, and then he names his patron, about them. The decision to undertake such a thing is neither needless nor injudicious, for some of my predecessors have not completed their work. But you get the sense, right? It's a very, very similar structure. Here's my process. Here's what I've looked at. Thank you to a patron. Very, very interesting that it is the same kind of preface. Now, off record, I get to speculate. I wouldn't put this, I think, in a publication. But it is interesting to me, too, that you find this kind of preface among medical writers, and Luke is often associated with being a physician. So is it that somebody read Luke's preface and said, like, wow, doctors tend to do this. He's got some medical terminology, must be a doctor. The designation of Luke is later, but I find that to be an interesting little sort of.
Now, I don't understand this from any standpoint, because she's like, well, I wouldn't go into a publication and put this, but I do find it interesting that there's a physician-like term here. And one of the things that she was saying is that she relates this specifically to the evidence that a physician has a similar argument of how they open their preface to a Patreon who supported the work that they did. Now, she ties that to Theophilus, who is mentioned at the beginning of both Luke and Acts, but she's not afraid to say that there are similarities to this Patreon account, as well as it relates to the specifics of a medical undertaking of writing a physician-like opening. Now, she isn't willing to go public in this. And I asked the question to Dr. Walsh, why? Why not? Why would you not put that in a publication? If you're seeing a connection, if you're seeing a relatable cause to say, hey, there's an interesting tidbit here. We find this similarity in this medical language over here. The problem is, and Dr. Walsh brought up a good point, is that this isn't the only medical manual that is connected to Luke's gospel. I've showed this multiple times in the writings and research that I have done on the subject of Luke, which is my favorite gospel. And I'm going to pull up my notes here because this is a part of the research that I have done. And I'm going to show a couple of things in relation to the language of Luke being physician-like. I have a quote here in my notes on Jerome, who wrote about the gospel of Luke. Now, he states in his writings that Luke was a physician of Antioch. So he's saying that he's Syrian descent, and that but notice what he says here, and I underlined it for us all, as his writings indicate. So if Luke specifically is writing in a certain way, and here's Jerome, who's translating this over into the Latin Vulgate. His experience with Luke is that he found a lot of terminology and a lot of linguistics that required him to go back to almost medical manuals to show the evidence of proper translation of Greek words that Luke is using, both in the gospel and in Acts. He moves that over into a Latin word that would be best understood in the Latin language. So here's a guy who is prolific in Greek and Latin. And when he gets to Luke's gospel and Acts, he's like, look, the guy's a physician, his writings indicate it. And he says he was not unskilled in the Greek language. And adhere to the Apostle Paul, companion of all of his journeyings, he wrote a gospel concerning which the same Paul says, we send with him the brother, the praise in the gospels among all the churches. And to the Colossians, Luke, the beloved physician, salutes you. And to Timothy, Luke only is with me. Some suppose that whenever Paul in his epistle says, according to my gospel, he means the book of Luke. And that Luke not only was taught the gospel history by the Apostle Paul, who is not with the Lord in the flesh, but also by other apostles. This he too at the beginning of his work declares, even as they delivered unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. So he wrote the gospel as he had heard it, but composed the Acts of the apostle as he himself had seen. In summary, there's four major things that need to be pointed out, and I have them highlighted here on the screen. Number one, Luke is a physician. Two, his writings indicate he was a physician. Now, this is a very important thing to note, because what Dr. Walsh just acknowledged is that there is a connection or an interesting tidbit that brings Luke's preface to other medical language, other medical manuals, especially those who have a Patreon, perhaps like Luke did in Theophilus. 3, he was under the authority of the Apostle Paul when writing his gospel. And 4, he learned his information from Paul and the other apostles. And so when he wrote the data from which he had heard as an eyewitness, specifically in Acts, and reported the eyewitness testimony of those who he came across in the travels of Paul. Now, I'm going to scroll down here, and I want to revisit a couple of things. He says that Luke is a physician of Antioch, as his writings indicate. Now, let's look at the opening of Luke's gospel, just as Dr. Walsh had presented. Notice the words here, and I underlined key terms. Many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that had been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. And notice that the writer is admitting he's not an eyewitness. He has received this from the eyewitnesses. And he recognizes that many other people had already attempted to put together a gospel that would fit a criteria of eyewitness. And he uses it in an interesting tense, showing that people tried and maybe failed. So there were other accounts that were trying to, not necessarily evil or malicious or even trying to forge anything, but just simply trying to report anything and everything they could remember or heard rumor mill about Jesus of Nazareth, his teachings, his statements, his right, anything like that. This is what he is saying was attempted. But he feels like his account has more weight. He says, it seemed good to me, since I've carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to an orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus. This is two words in Greek, and this is what Dr. Walsh was talking about. You have theos and phileo. The loved by God literally is the idea here. So you have this loved by God person, whether that's like a code name or his actual name or descriptive name. This individual is apparently some sort of influence on Luke. Perhaps he is a Patreon. Some would say he's not a person, he represents a group. I don't think so. I actually think he is an actual person. But he goes on to say, most honorable Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things about which you have been instructed. So to me, that speaks specifically to an individual, perhaps someone who is interested in the life and ministry of Jesus, who has put together perhaps a very expensive research to be done in order to get the true and nature of all that Christ said and did amongst his people. But I want you to see a couple of things that I have in the summary here. The same word is used in Dr. Walsh's example that is also used in Hippocrates. Now remember, Hippocrates is in the BC era. We're talking 460 to 370. Now, he uses the word here in Greek, epikureson, which is an interesting word that is only unique, particularly to the writer of Luke, or I believe perhaps even maybe later. I think Luke's involved in Hebrews. Form of this is used. But Luke and Acts are really the only places you're going to find the word epikureson. Now, outside of that, this idea of undertaking was also utilized. A similar word of that was utilized in Dr. Walsh's example, but she didn't give you the other examples like Hippocrates. Notice how Hippocrates begins one of his medical treatises the same exact way. He states, as many has undertaken, epikureson, to speak or to write concerning the healing arts. Here it is. So it's interesting that when we're looking at Luke, he almost borrows the preface to, it seems like at this point, two, I would argue there are three medical language manuals that he is borrowing from. Dr. Walsh's example, Hippocrates, and there's even others that are implied in this. We see even just similarities with Galen. I'm going to give some examples of this in a minute where we have a lot of physician-like terms. There are so many, there's entire books written on this. And now it is actually getting traction again because people are willing to recognize this is too obvious to just reject. There's too many interesting connections to just throw away. Even Dr. Walsh on Bart Ehrman's own channel has finally come out and said, look, I wouldn't put this in publication, which I don't know why, unless you're afraid of ridicule. This speaks to almost a political agenda, in my opinion. This speaks to almost a political ideology. Why are you afraid to put in publication an obvious and interesting connection? And she could build on that connection with the examples I'm giving here, in addition to everything else. I just do not understand why the secular scholars, the atheistic and skeptical scholars that are out there, are so terrified of church history actually being right, about Jerome being right, about Irenaeus being right, about Clement being right, Clement of Alexandria. Why are we so afraid? Why are we afraid of the Muratorian fragment? Why are we afraid of the anti-Marcionite prologue? They have been telling us this from day one. And she makes sure to add into the plug at the end of this, like, well, you got to understand something here. The name Luke is interesting and all because he's a physician, claimed to be with Paul. But remember, these are later inscriptions. Well, no, they're not. They're not later inscriptions. They're telling us from day one, including Jerome here, that Luke was always behind it and that there's proof internally, not just externally, internally about these claims. So let me go back to my notes here because I want to continue to show this. The word epikureson, undertaken, has shown that these endeavors were not entirely successful. Many had tried to do this, just as many had come up with ideas of healing or recipes to bring healing to disease, and that they tried and failed. Many were trying to do that. And so when a lot of these medical manuals are coming out, they're saying, look, many have attempted to heal these things, but I've come up with an idea. I've come up with a solution. I've come up with something better. Luke's using that same methodology. He's saying, okay, many have tried to write accounts of Jesus, but I have written a more orderly and one with certainty, because it is not based on just ideas or hearsay, but rather it was delivered to us by the eyewitnesses who handed them down. So he's saying my account is secure. It is certain. It is very instructive because it came from the horse's mouth. It came from those who are with him. He has collected and done the due diligence to bring a recipe of success, just as a medical doctor would come to find some sort of formula to bring healing, as we see in these other medical languages. A third thing that's interesting in summary is that another word should not be missed in the word many. Now, why did Luke's account survive while others failed to persevere? Why is it that Luke's account was almost the exception to the rule? If many had tried to do this, why is it that his survived antiquity, especially if it was written only to one single individual, Theophilus? Well, this is interesting because this goes back to the authorship and apostolic authority. Consider a few thoughts. Number one, The letter would have to come from an eyewitness and approved by apostolic authority to be distributed amongst the churches. The churches were started by the apostles. Luke is with an apostle. They're not going to receive anonymous letters or random letters of people who just want to share their opinion. The churches were only receiving, guarding, reading, and distributing that which was delivered to them under apostolic authority. So his letter must have been, or the two, if you would, Luke and Acts, must have been under apostolic advisory and authority. We have already seen the historical attestation of this gospel being authorized by Paul. He states it in Jerome's account. We see this in other accounts as well. Today's a shorter episode. We're not going to go through a whole summary. But there also needs to be reputable connections to the authorities that are behind these teachings or these sayings. It can't be Luke. He admits in the preface he's not an eyewitness. So what good is an account that is being addressed to an individual without notifying the individual of who he's writing? Now, look, this is the point. Theophilus didn't receive some anonymous letter. He knew who it came from, especially if he's sponsoring it. Luke's not going to be writing something that is set up to fail if he's admitting others have already tried and attempted to do so, and it didn't work out for them. So this kind of goes back to the authorship issue. I like this point that John Wyndham, he was an old-time Anglican scholar, he said it this way: Luke's preface would have been meaningless to the original reader unless the author's name had been known. Like I said, who in the world is going to receive this letter? Who's going to receive an anonymous letter written to a specific person, but the specific person has no return? Like, okay, who sent me this random giant account of Jesus that took a lot of money, time, and energy to get all that collected in the orderly account that it was, didn't have the decency to put their name on it? Of course, the tradition began with the recipient and the writer. And this tradition has been maintained by those who distributed this throughout the churches. And that's why we have so many apostolic people attesting the name Luke to this gospel, which is in the second point. Why Luke? My goodness, folks, if this is a forgery, why would the churches attribute this to Luke? He's admitting he's not an eyewitness. He's already put himself in a third class. If you have a primary source through Jesus himself, and he has given this teaching through eyewitnesses, these are the second-hand people. These are the ones that are not speaking the words of Jesus, but hearing and repeating and sending out through written or an oral tradition. Luke is in that third group. He wasn't with Jesus. He was with those who were with Jesus. So giving a gospel, if you're trying to sell this thing, would be doing what we see in the Gnostic text, putting Thomas's name or Mary's name or Philip's name or Peter's name or Paul's name on one of these texts. Not Luke. You don't find Luke being used in any other writings of these forgeries trying to pretend to be Luke. Who would do that? He's an insignificant figure that only shows up a handful of time in the writings of Paul. Leon Morris put it well when he said this: Luke was not, as far as we know, a person of prominence in the early church. Has to have two such considerable volumes as these fathered onto him without reason. If people were guessing, they would not be much more likely to come up with an apostle? Question mark, right? Yeah. I mean, you put an apostle on this, not Luke. He wasn't that prominent. He wasn't that significant. He wasn't a hero. It's not like he did something fantastic and 5,000 people came to Christ or something. He was a companion who was with Paul, who Paul called beloved. So let's talk about a couple things. And I'm going to scroll through this in the physician-like instances. Now, this is not a replete list. It's not a full list. There's more and more that could be said here, but I am going to show you just a handful of these just to give you an idea. Luke is the only gospel writer that recorded Jesus' statement, "Physician, heal yourself," in Luke 4:23. It is stated as being a proverb that Luke would have perhaps recognized. Maybe one of the eyewitnesses said, "Hey, Luke, you're gonna get a kick out of this since you're a doctor and all." Jesus made this interesting statement, this interesting comment, proverb. He said something like, "Physician, heal yourself. Does that ring a bell? Something you got in training? Luke is the only one that attests to this line. Another one. He also demonstrates grace towards his fellow physicians when he recounts the events of Peter's mother-in-law and also other people, like the issue with the woman who had a blood flow issue. So let's take that one, for example. Let's look at the events of this woman who was with the issue of blood. Mark is a little bit harder on her. Mark says, now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and suffered many things from many physicians. Now, this is interesting. Luke changes things up here. He rewords this just a little bit to take it easy on the physicians. He says, now a woman having a flow of blood for 12 years who had spent all of her livelihood on physicians and could not be healed by any. Luke 8:43. Notice the difference here in how he handles this. He's basically trying to say, well, the physicians tried. I mean, they did all they could. She spent everything. They did everything they could to heal this woman. It just wouldn't work. Mark's almost saying the physicians made it worse for the woman. Now, that's interesting. Why is he being more forgiving towards physicians, where Mark seems to be blaming physicians? Third example, Matthew and Mark speak only of a fever. Luke makes sure to emphasize that it was a high fever. If you go to Matthew 8:14, Mark 1:30, you see that this woman, Peter's mother-in-law, had a specific fever that was just listed as fever. Luke thought it was important enough to give you a better diagnosis, that there are different ranges of a fever, even before the time of having a thermometer to check if you have 100 or 104. See, there's a difference between 100 and 104. We wouldn't say, we call them low grade and high grade fevers. Luke wanted to be specific. Perhaps when he spent time with Peter, when he was traveling with Paul, when learning this story from Peter, he asked Peter, and Peter said, well, my mother-in-law had a fever. What kind of fever? Was it really bad? I mean, how bad was it? And maybe Luke got a description from Peter and said, okay, this was a severe case. The same thing happens when he runs into the issue of the story of the man that had leprosy. In the story of leprosy, Luke 5:12, Luke speaks of a certain man being full of leprosy, demonstrating an advanced case as compared to just having leprosy, as it speaks in Matthew 8:2-4. Just a man with leprosy. Leprosy could be a couple of ways. You could have a couple of spots on your face, or a couple on your hand, or a couple on your feet, or you could have a full body covered in leprosy. And so when Luke's learning the story, being the physician that he is, if he is actually a physician, he's going to want to know the extent of this man's severity. Did he have just like a piece of showing on his face where he had to cover that one section? Did he have it just on a shoulder blade? I mean, what are we talking here? They're like, no, Luke, he was covered in leprosy. And so Luke comes in behind Matthew and goes, full of leprosy. More specific, better diagnosis. 5, he's the only one that makes mention of Jesus' circumcision in Luke 2:21. What makes this even more unusual is that he's the only non-Jewish writer. Mark's gospel, backed by Peter, a Jew, John, a Jew, Matthew, a Jew, writing to Jews. Of all the people you think would have mentioned the circumcision of Jesus, it would have been Matthew, right? No, it was Luke, who also speaks of miraculous births, which I'm going to get to in a second. He's also the only one to record that Malchus, though he's unnamed by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John later reveals his name in John 18. Malchus had his ear chopped off when Peter pulled out a sword, who was also unnamed in those gospels until John. John tells us it was Peter. Swings a sword, cuts off the ear of Malchus. Now, all of them are telling us this event happens. None of us are telling us what happened after the ear hit the ground. Luke is the only gospel writer that tries to figure out how a dismembered body part was restored, that it was taken up off the ground by Jesus, put back on the side of Malchus, and healed. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. I mean, you think anybody else would have thought about remembering that point, like Matthew or Mark, specifically through Peter's testimony, who cut the guy's ear off to begin with? You think somebody would have remembered something like that? Well, It's Luke that mentions the ear being healed. He's also the only one that mentions particularly two miraculous births. John the Baptist in chapter 1, born to elderly parents who were past childbearing years. And also Jesus, who was born of a virgin in relation to the Isaiah prophecy. Another thing, the woman with an 18-year back condition in Luke 13:11 through 13. A woman, is stated, was there who had been disabled. Astheneos is the Greek word here. So she is given a diagnosis by the writer. By the way, none of the other writers mention this circumstance, nor use the medical language we see here. So he says there's this woman who had been astheneos by a spirit for over 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. And when Jesus saw her, he called out to her, "Woman, you are free of your disability." Now, notice a couple things here. She was diagnosed with the term only Luke uses. Now, the idea of being bent over is a complete diagnosis. Luke has evaluated this story and gave medical opinion and professional assertion to her condition. And he's the only one in all the New Testament using these Greek terms. Now, he makes sure also to document the timeline of the disability, 18 years. He says, you are free. Apopalaluse. Apopalaluse is an interesting word too, because it's the ancient Greek medical term for relaxing tendons, membranes, and for dealing with taking off of bandages. And you can see Hobart, who, by the way, Hobart is the one that wrote an entire book on the medical language of Luke. Now, he has been overly criticized for years for being exaggerating and overkill. Listen, I've made this statement. Michael Jones on Inspiring Philosophy, when we co-wrote a script on Luke, we talked about this. Just because he went overboard doesn't mean everything he said was right. He made a lot of viable connections, including ones like this, demonstrating where there is a connection with Luke and other medical language and medical manuals throughout the different writings of the world. And that cannot be ignored. Here are three Greek terms unique to Luke, but found in other medical manuals and languages for diagnosis of people with certain conditions. Another example, and this is the last one I'll do, the Good Samaritan. Luke added a number of medical touches which prove him distinctly as a physician well-versed in wound treatment as practiced in his time. The use of wine for soothing the wounds is recommended by Hippocrates and later by Galen. An early recognition of the antiseptic qualities of alcohol. Experience also taught the ancients that wounds bathed in oil would heal better. The coating would serve to protect the wound, from which we now know to be bacteria, or if you would, external contamination. So here's a couple things to consider as we're looking at these. When I'm dealing with the subject of the medical language in Luke, it's interesting. For years, we have been saying this. We've been publicizing this in written form and lectures, going to different churches and speaking in engagements. All of a sudden, we finally get an admission from somebody like Dr. Walsh on Bart Ehrman's own channel saying, here's an interesting tidbit on the side. I wouldn't put it in publication, but there's a medical manual being almost mimicked here when somebody had a Patreon who is supporting the person, and then they're using the same language of a medical person who also had a Patreon. But I say, why stop there, Dr. Walsh? And by the way, I'd love to have a conversation with Dr. Walsh. She seems very kind, very considerate. I would gladly have a conversation and say, let's talk about Luke's gospel and why you should not be afraid to put into a published work these connections, because I just gave you 9, and I'm telling you there are dozens more that need to be covered. And I have covered. I've done entire lectures. I've done entire episodes on this. But I find it interesting that Dr. Bart Ehrman's channel had Dr. Walsh do a 8-minute clip of the initial idea behind Luke's preface. And she put this little plug in there, and most people are going to miss it. And I'm not going to miss it because I've been shouting from the rooftops these things for a very, very long time. So I just wanted to take a few minutes, 30 minutes or so to go over this and give my assessment of why I think this is kind of a bad situation to be putting this out there right now, because all of us Christians on this side who hold traditional authorship of the Gospels are saying, we've been saying this for years. I mean, everybody in the church has said this all the way back to the 2nd century. I mean, this is pretty obvious. We're not surprised by this. And we're saying that there's more and more and more that needs to be discovered, because that one little tidbit is just scratching the surface, Dr. Walsh. So let's have a conversation anytime you want. I'm willing to have it. Let's talk about Luke's gospel. It'll be really, really good for you. All right, folks, that was all we had today for you. Hopefully you learned something from Luke's gospel, especially the preface, that yes, we do believe that Luke, the physician who traveled with the Apostle Paul, penned the words of the Gospel of Luke as well as the book of Acts. And we've been fighting and defending that for years. And it's just interesting that now skeptics are willing to admit certain things are just conveniently and weirdly and in just some ways a tidbit connection to what we've been just really shouting from the rooftops for years. All right, folks, I hope you have a great night. God bless, grace, and peace to you.